Alright, welcome everybody to today's school chess lesson, our Lunchtime Chess Lectures series. We're going to have a look today at one of the most important strategies, probably the number one strategy for when you're playing your games of chess. So the number one strategy, hopefully everyone's heard of the three golden rules, and the number one strategy is the first strategy of those three golden rules. It's the very first thing you should be doing at the start of every game, and we're going to look at today why it's so important to control the center of the board. Okay, so the middle of the board, the center of the board is the most important area of the board to control. Okay, we've got four squares here in the middle of the board, and they are the most powerful area. So all of your moves, particularly at the start of the game, should be focused on controlling the center of the board, either moving your pieces right into those squares or having your pieces somewhere that can attack those squares. So a few examples, you could have your knight attacking towards the center of the board. That's pointing in towards those two squares, so that's a good move. You could move your pawn and your bishop out this way, and your bishop's going to be moving in, pointing towards the center of the board. So there's an unlimited number of ways of actually controlling the center of the board. A strategy is all about having an idea in your mind that will help to choose or help you choose one of your moves. Okay, so at any time during the start of the game, or in fact all the way through into the middle game and even the end game, you should always be thinking, well, the center of the board is more important or more powerful than the edge of the board. So if you're trying to make a decision, should I move my knight to the left or the right, you're usually going to have, with that strategy in mind, the ability to make a good choice. You don't want to go to the edge of the board, you prefer to go towards the middle of the board. Okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about today, is looking at why is it so important to control the center of the board. If while I'm starting this game off and showing you the first few moves, if anybody has any suggestions as to why you think it's so important to control the center of the board, type them into your chat box so that I can get to see some of those suggestions. Why is it so good to be controlling the middle of the board? Why is it better to be in the middle than it is to be, for example, over here on the edge of the board? Right, we could control the four red squares on the edge of the board, pile everything up over there, really dominate that area. Why is it any better to dominate the four squares in the middle of the board? What is it about the center that's so good? All right, while you're thinking about that and starting to type your moves in, we're going to start with this game. And this is a game which really shows you the power of controlling the center of the board. There are lots of Grandmaster tournaments all around the world every year, and what happens is all of the games that are played are recorded. We write the moves of all of the tournament games that we play down. I do that when I play serious tournament games as well, and all the best chess players in Australia and all around the world do that. So we write our moves down so that if anyone ends up with a really brilliant game, we can replay that, and you can see strategies that really top players have played, and you can learn from them. So the first move in this game that was played was pawn to e4, and straight away gets his pawn into the center of the board. Right, the pawn's also threatening another one of the squares in the middle of the board. So right from the very first move, white is claiming his stake over the middle of the board. Okay, and that's why that move is one of the most common moves that you see. It also lets the bishop and the queen come off the back row and into the attack, so that would be following strategy number 2 to develop your pieces off the back row. But you can see mainly, if we're looking at the center of the board, he's claimed his stake right away in the middle of the board. Now black plays a move which we call the French defense. Okay, the French defense. Now this is a move that was championed or played most commonly in France in around about the 1800s, early 1800s, and so it was given the name the French defense because all of the players, all the good players in the world who came from France used to use this move and play this opening strategy. Now you see that only moves one step forward. It's not right into the center of the board, but it is putting some pressure onto the middle of the board. You'll see with his next move what the plan is for black. White's second move should be a pretty obvious move, because if you ever get a chance, you always want to try and get a wall of pawns. Okay, we have two pawns here next to each other in the center of the board, and that's your most powerful attacking formation. Two pawns next to each other is the most powerful attacking formation you can have. And if you can keep that wall of pawns, even better. So you can see why that is so powerful, because the pawns cover both the black and the white squares in front of them. All right? So there are black and white squares in front of those pawns, all through the center of the board, that are now being covered by white. So this is a really dominating position if you can keep your 2 pawns in the center of the board. Now, black's plan with the French defense is obviously not to allow that wall of pawns to stay there, but he advances his pawn to d5 and gets what we call a pawn chain. Pawn protects pawn protects pawn, and that pawn chain fights back and attacks in the counterattacks in the center of the board. Right? So if, for example, white takes black, black takes back, and now we're dead even. Okay, both players have got 1 piece each in the middle of the board. White's got 1, black's got 1. Right? So usually white doesn't want to take that pawn. Okay, instead of taking the pawn, he wants to try and keep his wall of pawns, try and keep those 2 pawns next to each other in the middle of the board. All right, so what can we do to try and keep those 2 pawns next to each other? Well, if you're not careful, black's pawn is going to take your pawn. All right, you can do pawn takes pawn. So we're going to have to do something to protect it. So what white does here is brings his knight off the back row and uses his knight to protect the pawn. All right, now we can see as soon as white starts developing pieces off the back row, he's moving them towards the middle of the board. So we'll start talking about some of the reasons why it's so important to be in the middle of the board. One person suggested that it gives your pieces more options. Right? Your pieces can move to more different squares, and that's exactly right. That's certainly one reason why you should be controlling the center. Let's take this knight, for example. If we put the knight in the corner of the board, you can see there are only 2 squares that the knight could attack. Right? Now, if you compare a knight in the corner, attacking only 2 squares, right, to when he comes forwards towards the center of the board, that knight can not only attack those 2 squares, but now look at all the other squares all the way around that he can attack. So that's a total of 8 squares that the knight can attack. Exactly the same piece. It's just in a different position, and it's 4 times as powerful. It's 4 times as strong. So when you think about that with all of your pieces, particularly these strong guys across the back row, right, if those pieces come closer to the center, they could be up to 4 times as powerful as if they're just sitting on the corner of the board or sitting on the back row. So when you start off a game of chess, you start with exactly the same army as your opponent. Right? You've got no advantage. You've got exactly the same pieces. So what you want to try and do is you want to try and maneuver your pieces into better positions, which is going to make them more powerful. And then if your pieces are more powerful, you're going to be able to take more of your opponent's pieces out. If you take more of your opponent's pieces, you're going to have a bigger army. If you've got a bigger army, you're going to have a better chance of winning the game. So definitely that's one of the reasons. The other reason that it's so good to control the center of the board is because when you're in the middle of the board, you can choose to attack left or right. Okay? You can also bring your pieces back for defense nice and easily. And we're going to see in this game how when you've got all your pieces piled up into the center, no matter which way your opponent tries to duck or dodge or run away, you're going to be able to zoom and attack them. Okay? So being in the middle of the board gives you a choice to attack left or right, both directions. All right, black's moved his bishop off the back row, developing a piece, setting up a pin. And a pin is where the knight is stuck to the spot. He's locked down into his position. If the knight tries to move away, it's going to be putting the bishop's going to be putting white's king in check. So what that does is that sort of stops that pawn from being protected. So next move, black can take the pawn. White can't take it back, because if it does, the king's in check again. All right, so that pin there is another way of attacking this square in the middle of the board. So trying to keep an attack going in the middle of the board. So white needs to either find a way to get out of the pin or to protect that pawn. And he chooses in this game to protect the pawn with his bishop, and moving the bishop forwards, the bishop protects the pawn. And you can see that the pieces that he's developing, the knight and the bishop, are coming as close to the center of the board as possible. Right? The knight covers those 2 squares in the middle of the board, and the bishop is also covering the pawn. So they're all pointing towards the middle of the board. Right? Black's fighting also for the same thing. And there's actually an interesting an interesting trick here that white has. Right, there's an interesting trick that that white can do because his pieces are all in the middle of the board. If black does pawn takes pawn, and then you can notice that this red pawn here on d4 is not protected anymore. Black has to be very careful, because if black does try and take the pawn, we can do this sneaky move with the bishop, which can attack in either direction, zooms out to the left-hand side of the board, puts black into check, and now black's queen is left undefended. So next move, white's queen can take black's queen. Black will get out of check, blocking or moving, and then queen takes the queen. So there are some tricks here that black has to be a little bit careful of. Black keeps developing some pieces and attacking again towards the middle of the board. So knight f6 is good, pointing his knight in towards this e4 square, so everything's joining in and attacking e4. White's got all his pieces protecting it, black's got all his pieces attacking it. And that's normal for this opening. So now white takes a leaf out of black's book and tries for a pin, which does the same thing as what black's bishop did to him a few moves ago. By pinning the knight, it stops the knight from actually taking anything. Okay, except here, the knight is pinned against the queen. So if black's knight moves away, white's taking the queen for nothing. Right? And that's what we call a pin, where that knight is pinned to the spot. It's locked down and it can't move anywhere, because if it does, the queen behind it gets taken. Right? So that means that that knight can no longer take the pawn in the middle of the board. Right? So it looks like the pawn and the knight are attacking it, but really it's only the pawn that could attack it. It looks like the knight and the bishop for white are defending it, but the knight's pinned still, so really it's only the bishop that's attacking it. So the bishop that's protecting. So it's a big fight for the centre of the board here. Alright, black plays a good move here, swapping off pawn for pawn. Right? He can't get any more pieces in to attack it, so he says, well, I'll just do a trade of pawn for pawn. At least that way, white doesn't have a wall of pawns. Right? Before we had two pawns next to each other in the middle. Now we've got rid of one of those pawns, so that's sort of good. You don't want to let your opponent keep that wall of pawns, it's too strong. And white's happy as well, because white's got a pawn and a bishop in the middle of the board, so he's still got most of his pieces pointing in towards the centre of the board. Alright, black plays pawn to c5. Now the idea with that move is again to counter-attack in the centre of the board. Yep. So he's trying to get rid of all of those pieces that white has. White put all his pieces into the middle of the board, and black's trying to swap them off once they get into the middle, because swap them off, then they're not there anymore. So if white does pawn takes pawn, black can take him back, and you can see white's got a little bit less control in the middle of the board, just one piece left in the middle of the board then. All right, so the more pieces that black can swap off that get away from the middle of the board, the less control white's going to have. All right, white wants to keep as much as he can in the middle of the board, so instead of moving that pawn or using it to take his opponent, he needs to bring some more pieces off the back row of the attack and use his knight here to attack or protect that pawn on d4. Okay, so far, every single move of this game has been attacking either towards e4 or d4. Okay, and one of those pieces is always protected as well by white's other pieces. So the knights and the bishops and things that have been developing. White's got 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces off the back row in good developed positions, good attacking positions, and they're all coming off the back row to try and protect or attack, I guess, same thing, some of those squares in the middle of the board. Okay, so it's all about the centre, here. Okay, let's just pause for a second and answer a question that's here. Okay, so the question was that the black knight to d4, then c3 can take the queen, because white has to take the queen and has to give it with his bishop. All right, so we've got to be careful that these pieces can't capture here, because when you do that, you lose the queen. Okay, the bishop's going to take the queen. So some of those moves, you've just got to be a bit careful to think 2 steps ahead and work out what your opponent's going to do next. We're just going to get to the key point in this game here. Is a couple more moves away. Black does pawn takes pawn, and white takes it back. So black's been trying to swap off pawns. Right? Black swapped off the c pawn and the d pawn to get rid of white's 2 pawns that are in the centre of the board. So instead of having a pawn wall, he's left with a knight and a bishop in the middle of the board. Okay, not as powerful as having two pawns next to each other, but still, because white's dominating the middle of the board, what black's plan should be now is to try and get the knight out and swap off knight for knight, to try and get the queen out of the pin here so he can swap off knight for bishop and get rid of those two pieces that are in the middle of the board, not leave them for white to dominate the middle of the board. But black sees an opportunity to attack, right? And he plays queen out and uses his queen for an attack. Now this is pretty tricky. Okay, the queen first of all is threatening white's bishop, right? Secondly, the queen is supporting the bishop and the bishop's attacking the knight. So it's actually got two pieces that are attacking white's knight there. Okay, so this is a bit of a fork. The queen's attacking the bishop and it's supporting the bishop to attack the knight. But what I don't like about that move is that the queen has moved herself to the edge of the board. She's basically decided to just give up on the middle of the board and leave white with those knight and the bishop in the middle of the board dominating the center. So white thinks, well, you know, got the pieces in the middle of the board, bishop's in danger, knight's in danger, and actually planned through, you know, must have been at least 4 or 5 moves ahead, and sees that he can actually afford to sacrifice one of his pieces if he can keep everything in the middle of the board. No matter which way his opponent's king's going to run, he's going to be able to chase it down and get a checkmate. So white's move was to save his bishop and use his bishop to take the knight. Right? Bishop takes knight. Now, bishop takes knight, first of all, if black just captures back, has meant that black, when he castles, is going to have his king wide open. White can go for some easy checkmates, get his queen into the attack check across there, and then maybe try and get his queen down onto the H spot, protected by the bishop in the middle of the board. Right? And there's going to be a checkmate. You can see why bishop in the middle is so powerful, because it can attack both directions. You're attacking over to the queen side at the same time as attacking to the king side. Right? So after bishop takes knight, that's what we're saying, is that if black just decides to take back, then his king's going to be a little bit open. It's going to be a bit too risky for black to castle, and his king will be stuck in the middle of the board. And in the same way that if your pieces are in the middle, they can attack in both directions. If your king's in the middle of the board, you can be attacked from both directions. Right, so that's why it's not good to have your king in the middle of the board, because you can get attacked from both directions. Okay. All right, black doesn't have to take that bishop there. Black doesn't have to take the bishop. Black can actually take some other pieces, and then maybe later on he can think about taking the bishop. Black sees a little combination that I think he saw before when he was threatening with his queen to take the bishop, and also using his queen and bishop on the black squares to gang up on white's knight on c3. Okay, the plan that black saw was just a simple take. Bishop takes knight. White's now in check. Yeah. White's king's in check, so he's got to get himself out of check. So the obvious way of doing that is to take him back. Then black's queen comes down and takes the pawn check. And now, when white blocks the check, queen forwards, it leaves one of white's pieces undefended. Now, which is that piece that's not protected anymore? The queen was protecting it, but when the queen moves in the way to block off this check, which piece is left open? All right, we can see that straight away. That's very good for those players who suggested that the rook in the corner here is no longer protected. And it gives black a chance just to take that rook. Let's go back a step and see, after that exchange, after white's in check here, why did white choose to move his queen in the way and leave his rook open to be taken? Right? Because the rook on a1, that's the second most powerful piece. It's worth 5 points. But when we look here, white's thinking to himself, well, controlling the centre of the board, let's have a look. We've got these two pieces dominating the middle. The third piece, the bishop, is developed off the back row, and that's also pointing towards the middle of the board. If he plays queen forwards one, then his queen will be in the attack as well. So it's going to be a total of 4 pieces in really powerful attacking positions in the middle of the board. On the other hand, black is only going to have one piece off the back row and attacking. And once it takes the rook, it's not going to be in the middle of the board at all. So the queen goes to d2, sacrificing the rook, allowing his rook to be taken, and black is putting white's king in check again. King moves out of the way, and this leaves the second rook open for capture. So black takes the second rook. Now we have to see from here whether these four pieces that white has are in powerful enough positions to get black's king into checkmate. Because if he can't do a checkmate, he's lost this game for sure. He's just sacrificed both of his rooks. Right? Sacrificed one rook in one corner, another rook in the other corner. So he sacrificed 10 points. Right? That's more than a queen that he's given up. But he's keeping his four pieces in the middle of the board, and the only piece that black's got doing anything at all coming off the back rank is that queen, which is now in the corner of the board, right out of the way. So black's got really no chance of attacking white, and white's pieces have got some. Well, they're in very good positions. All right, so let's just have a look at that. What we'll do is, first of all, black's queen, which is the only piece that's off the back row and attacking, can attack all of those squares. All right, the whole back row and a couple of pawns. Yeah, not much. Not much. All right, we're going to colour in green all the squares that white's pieces can attack. So the bishop's got these squares covered. The other bishop has got all of those squares covered. The knight covers all of those squares, and white's queen covers all of these squares. So just compare that. Would you rather be in white's position, where white's controlling all of those squares that are coloured in green, or black, who's only got one piece off the back row, and it's not anywhere near the middle of the board, it's just shoved away in the corner, and all it's doing is covering that back line, which there's no pieces, there's no enemy pieces on there anyway. Right? White's threatening all sorts of things, and has got a lot of squares very close to black's king covered. So that was why white's chosen to sacrifice those two rooks, 10 points. He's taking a big risk here, he's sacrificing those, but he thinks that, well, we've got all these pieces in good positions, we're covering all this territory, there's got to be a way of doing a checkmate. And the easiest way to do checkmate is just to threaten checkmate. And if your opponent doesn't notice it, you've got him. So the move that white did was knight takes pawn. All right? Knight takes pawn. So he's played knight takes pawn here. And when he does knight takes pawn, he's now got a little bit of a threat. Because with the bishop, that's going to be supporting white's queen. So white's queen can come all the way down to the back row, protected by the bishop, and there's checkmate next move. All right, so he's threatening a checkmate. So let's see. Checkmate is threatened. Can black escape from it? Well, black's not allowed to castle, which would be the normal move you'd try and do to get your king safe. Why is it that black can't castle? Why can black not castle in this position? Why is it an illegal move? Because the square that the knight is attacking is covered. So when the king moves, he's moving into check and then out of check. So when you're castling, you're not allowed to move through a check. Right? So black now cannot castle because he's going to be moving through check. And castling is such a special move, you're not allowed to castle when you're in check, through check, to get out of check, or into check. So you've got to make sure your king is completely safe before you can do castling. So black's in facing a bit of a problem. He can't castle. All right, he can't take this bishop. All right, because if he takes that bishop to try and get out of checkmate, the queen comes down, protected by the knight, and there's checkmate. What black tried for was a blocking defense. He moved his knight to d7, and that stops the white's queen from coming through. Okay, it blocks off the d8 square, so white's queen can't get through anymore. But there's still a checkmate coming, and there's nothing that black can do about it from here. All right, there's a checkmate in 5 moves from here, and all that has to happen is that all of white's pieces just have to move closer and closer and closer to the king. And it's a lot easier for white's pieces to move closer to the king because they're all in the middle of the board. Doesn't matter where the king tries to go. If he tries to go left or right, we've got him covered no matter what. And black, well, black's pieces really can't join in the defense at all. Black's just got to sit there and hope for the best. All right, we've had a couple of suggestions. One suggestion was moving the knight, which is a good move, check, and attacking the rook at the same time. So that's a nice fork. But remember, you're already 2 rooks down. So unless you can get a checkmate, winning back 1 rook or even winning 2 rooks isn't going to be enough. So white wants to go for a checkmate and first moves queen down to d6. Right, because the plan is, again, pretty simple. Next move, the queen is just going to move to e7. And when the queen moves to e7 right in front of the king, it'll be protected by the bishop, and there's going to be checkmate. So next move, queen to e7, protected by the bishop, checkmate. So that's the threat. Black's now faced with a checkmate next move. The other thing that the queen's doing is the queen is now covering f8 as well as e7. So if we go back a move and you've done instead knight c7 check, it gives the king a chance to escape out towards the right-hand side behind a barrier of pawns, a little bit safer. When you do queen to d6, now we can move the knight out of the way, right? And the queen is covering all of those squares. Okay. So in fact, knight to c7 would be checkmate. Right? If you can do knight c7, that's checkmate next move. So what can black do to get out of that as a checkmate? Well, pawn takes bishop was the only thing you could think of. Because now the move knight c7 isn't checkmate anymore. The king's got 1 escape square, which is d8. Okay, king's had to move, so there's no chance of castling anymore. He is trapped right in the middle of the board. So what can white do to finish him off? And again, threaten checkmate and just see if black has a chance to defend it. Well, white plays knight to d5, and now there's checkmate next move in two different ways. Okay, the knight is covering both c7 and e7. Right, see, the knight's protecting both of those squares. So that means that next move, the queen can either go queen to e7, checkmate, protected by the knight, or he could play queen to c7, protected by the knight. So he's faced with a checkmate on both sides. Okay, he's faced with the knight covering both directions. All right, the move that black played in the game, he had to defend one of them, was just, well, first of all, a delaying move, a sacrifice. He just sacrifices his queen just to survive one more move. That was a bit of a waste, but I guess he wants to last as long as he can. That's the best thing he can do. Then he plays rook to e8 and covers the e7 square, which lets white do a checkmate on c7. Right? And now the knight is covering the queen's protected, attacking the king, and even though it looks like black's king is safe because he's got a few pieces around him, it's not safe at all. That's a checkmate. Right? If he had chosen not to save with rook across to e8, right? If he didn't do that, then next move, white would have put the queen onto e7 and got a checkmate on the other side. Right? The queen's now protected by the knight, and again, king can't move anywhere. Even though it looks like he's got a few pieces nearby, it's not helping him at all. So there was nothing else. White's threatening the checkmate on e7. As soon as black covers that, white can do the checkmate on c7, and black can't cover both of them at the same time. And so there we have a checkmate. And you can see at the end of the game, still white's pieces are all in the center of the board. And from the center, it means you can cover one side or the other side. And we saw that in this game where the queen on d6 could go left or right. So there's a few reasons to control the center of the board. First of all, your pieces are more powerful. And we saw that a few moves ago where white had all of those green squares covered. Right? Black just had a few yellow squares covered with his queen. Right? So having more pieces in the middle of the board gives you more control over territory. The other thing is your pieces that are in the middle of the board can move left to right. So when black tried to castle on the king side, the queen from the middle, or the knight from the middle, or the bishop could all cover that side of the board. When the king tried to hide in the opposite direction, you could get across and move that way as well. All right? When you play your games today and next week and every other time, really think about the middle of the board. It's not just powerful in the start of the game, it's powerful in the middle and it's powerful in the end. The middle of the board is the most important area that you can control. These 4 squares, I've highlighted them red for you. Every single game, try and aim your pieces into those 4 squares in the middle of the board. That's what you're aiming for. Good luck with your games. I will be sticking around for a little bit more time if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask about this game, about other games, or about just strategies in general. And I look forward to seeing you guys next week.